Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Thursday morning's lecture. Today, we're going to be starting with file streams. So, we're going to start with a file stream today, and then in our next lecture, we'll start with essential files. So, you'll notice that I've uploaded these PDFs to ease, but we're only going to cover about half of these PDFs. Hopefully, we'll get to the end of file streams today, but it is a lot of content. So just bear with me, and if you get lost somewhere, just tell me where you're getting lost. Slides are fairly nicely spread out to explain them as easily as possible, but if there is something that you might have missed, just point it out to me. Right, so the purpose for today is to show you how files will work in Visual Basics, to introduce you to the file stream object, how to create a file, how to close a file, and then at the end we've got sequential files, so how to save objects to a sequential file and how to read objects to a sequential file, but I don't think we'll be able to get to that today. Even the creation and closure of a file itself, I'm not sure if we're going to get to that today. So files in Visual Basics. Visual Basics sees files differently than differently to how you see files. So the way you would see files are your Explorer, your Explorer inside your Windows Explorer, I guess, and you'll see the name, you have dates, you've got types, you've got a size. Visual Basic sees it differently. Visual Basics only sees a file size. And keep in mind that this file size is also part of the information relevant to the file itself. So Visual Basics will see it in terms of how many bytes there are in this file. It will see it in terms of the location and, the total bytes you have, essentially. But all of this information becomes important when pointing out where to find the file. And this is where the file stream object becomes crucial. So it is important to note that Visual Basics does not impose any structure on files. It doesn't tell the file what structure to use specifically. You as a programmer will tell the file what to do. We need to provide the code on the structure ourselves. So however we store information, however we read information, we dictate what that file structure will be like, which generally means that you can open almost any file as long as you know what the structure of the file is. And that refers to text files, CSV files, DAT files, data files, database files. As long as you know what the structure is inside the file, you can open any file. Some of them do require special programs to open. If you think in terms of databases, how the file is interpreted, it's not going to be as simple as just simply opening up a stream and then reading in the information. Some of it requires a bit more than that. So I want to introduce you to a file stream. And this is the use of a library. So the file stream object comes from a library we'll be using. It comes from the system.io library. So file stream provides functionality for representing streams as bytes so that we can read and write from or to file objects. Think of it as a bridge between your secondary and your primary storage. And when I refer to your primary storage here, it's where your program will be active. It's where it's running. So your primary storage right now is where your active program of Visual Basics will be running. And your secondary storage is where the physical persistent version of the file is stored. A file stream belongs to the FileWorks class library, which is found inside the system.io library. And there's a few things you can do. Now, this is where you should not get lost. This is the important part. How do you work with a file stream object? So to create a file, we need to create a file stream object. A file stream object allows us to create a file, open a file for writing, open a file for reading, open an existing file for both reading and writing. Now, those four options become important because when you create a file stream, you have to indicate which one of these options will be needed. A file stream object is not standard, and we will need to specify where we can find it first. So we start off with the file stream and the location of the file stream object, the type itself. So we have private any variable name as system.io.filestream. Now remember this, it's a fully qualified name, but how many of you will remember to type out that name every single time? Especially in a test when you get stressed. Are you going to remember to write it out like that? You say yes, but in my experience, the answer is mostly no. So this becomes a bit tedious because you need to create an object of this file. So you've got private myFile as file system.io.filestream. Then inside your button click, you'll once again have the instantiation. So file equals new system.io.filestream. So you're repeating a lot of typing over here. Now, I know as things go along, you will have to type a lot in your programs in any case, but the more we can simplify it, we'll get to that in a moment. The more we can simplify it, it's input and output. The more we can simplify it, the better it will become. So this means the file stream class of the system.io namespace. So the system.io namespace is where the file stream is located. So we can essentially reduce the amount of typing by importing the system.io namespace. So you indicate at the very top before your class that you want to import the namespace. So you go import system.io, which then incorporates that namespace and those libraries into your program. So you can just call it generally without having to specify the location first. So now it changes from system.io.filestream to just filestream. It makes things a bit easier. So just keep that in mind. If you just write filestream, your program will complain if you don't have the imports. But most of the time it will suggest to add the imports or to add the location prior to the import. So it's not a train smash if you forget to put it in. Visual Studios will remind you to put it in at some point. And when we mark your theory papers, we're kind of lenient on this. As long as you have the actual file stream object, we will excuse the actual namespace location. All right, so that's one problem solved. Calling the file stream object and creating an instance of that object. But now, what is a file stream object actually? How do we work with it? So think about a file stream object as a placeholder that stores the content of the physical file in memory. So remember we spoke about your secondary storage and your primary storage? So your secondary storage is your hard drive or your USB, and your primary storage is the memory on PC, and your program will be active. So you've got your file located in your secondary storage, and in this case we're going to use a text file. And you've got your program in your primary storage. And that's where you create the file stream. Now, the moment you call the new file stream, it creates a temporary object, a placeholder for your file. Because you need to take what you have in your secondary storage and copy it over to your primary storage. That is how you get the information. Once you have that in your primary storage, your program can now interact with it. You can make changes, you can commit these changes, and then you can send it back to the secondary storage. So your temporary storage, your file stream object, keeps the information until it is committed. And keep in mind, when I say committed, it means you have to send it back. You have to make sure that everything you changed, it is sent back. And most importantly, you need to cut the connection. Remember we said it's like a bridge between your secondary and your primary storage? Now that bridge is a connection being established. Once that bridge is open, it's open for the usage it is intended for. But if you don't close that bridge, it can't be used again because you can't instantiate it again. So you need to make sure you close that connection. And we will show you after the recess, we will show you what happens if you don't close it. So don't be too concerned. Most of you will probably forget to close it at some point or another, and then your program will crash or it will complain, but it's a mistake you'll have to learn to deal with, because most of the times when you work with files and you open files multiple times in a program, you're somewhere going to forget to close it. So you need to remember what you need to fix specifically. So keep an eye on what the error is when you don't close it. So your file stream, once the connection has been closed, no longer is required, and then it dies in your primary memory because it's no longer required. And your changes are persisted. They're maintained inside the secondary storage because they have been committed. So your changes have been made, which is what we want. We want to work with it, modify it, send it back, and then make sure the changes we've made persist. All right. But that is just our basic introduction to a file stream of temporary placeholder. We still need to establish a connection or learn how to establish that connection. So we need to provide the necessary information so that a file stream object knows which files to form a connection with. Remember, you want a specific file here, so you need to identify that file. It needs to know which file to establish that connection with. So we have our imports IO, our class, our object declaration at the top, the file stream. Let's see, where's my cursor? So we've got our file stream object, and then we've got our new. And in our new stream, we have 3 arguments that always have to be there. The first argument is the location, second argument is the mode, and the third argument is the access. So this is what we're going to be focusing on right now by first looking at what is the location itself. So the first argument that must be provided is the location. It is a string option. We'll get to that question later on. You can have multiple file streams open, but it becomes very tricky to work with. Ideally, you want to open a file stream, use that specific file stream, and then close it. But it depends on the scope of your program itself. Ideally, I would say you work with one file stream, open that one file stream, and then close it once you've done, as it's just information you're reading in to be used in your program. So you potentially just read in the files one by one and then use them instead of opening up multiple file streams at the same time and then try and use them. And most of the times, if you do something like that, it will crash. Not all programming languages allow that as well. All right, so your location is a string. Purpose is to indicate the file name and location of where the physical file should or is located in secondary memory. Now, there's 2 things to keep in mind here. If only a file name is provided, no directory location, the file is saved locally, which means in the same folder as the executable program. So where you go into your folder structure, once you've created your VB application, somewhere in that folder you will see there's a .exe that can execute your program. Now, that is the executable program. If you don't add the directory location, then your file needs to be saved in that directory. Otherwise, you can essentially store the file anywhere on the computer, but then you need to provide the directory of where that file can be found. Otherwise, the program won't be able to access it. Otherwise, your program won't be able to access it. So you need to make sure of where this file is stored and how you place it. And also keep in mind that when you're reading a file, the format itself is not that important as long as a format meant for your program. Like I said, your application can read most formats as long as it's intended to be read by a specific program or by a program. Not all formats can just be read without any additional modifications. And we'll show you an example of that later as well. Right, then we've got the mode. Now remember when I told you earlier you are going to create a file stream for 4 specific purposes. And that's going to be create or to open and modify, to open and write, or to open and modify and write, or read and write. So the second argument that must be provided is the mode. It is an enumeration. We will be covering this. I won't leave it as self-study. We will be covering enumeration, so don't worry too much about that. The purpose is to indicate how the file should be opened. Now, the intended mode is very important because if a file does not exist, one must be created. And there's a reason why there's a description for this as well. So the only available options are file mode.create, create a new file, overwrite existing files. So if a file of the same name exists, it will override that file. File mode.create new, create new file, exception occurs if file exists. Now, you see the fact that the exception can occur? This is why we did try catch before we did file streams, because this is where a try catch will become very important. Then you've got file mode.open, open an existing file, and file mode.open or create, open existing files or create a new file. So if the file does exist, it opens it. If the file does not exist, it will create one for you. So for our purposes, we are only going to use the create and the open because you'll be using the try catch exceptions to determine whether the files do exist or not. And if they do exist, you'll open them. But there's an additional statement that we're going to use to determine that. Right. And then you have the access. So the access, what is the mode data type? Okay, so it's an enumeration. So it's essentially a integer. So you'll have one of these 4. So you'll use the enumerations that come with the file mode. So it's not really a data type that you have to be concerned with because you'll be using these specific statements, file mode.create, to make it easier for you. But essentially it's an enumeration. So it's an integer representation of what is being chosen. So it's 1 to 4. So 1, 2, 3, or 4. Not sure what the specific order of the values are. I'll actually have a look into that and let you know. Then you've got the access. The final argument to be supplied is the access. So like mode, it is also an enumeration, and it's also something that has a, where's my cursor? It's also something that has a representation for us. So it's better if you use the representation itself, the file access.read, because you know specifically what you're trying to access then, but you can use integers there as well. So the purpose is to indicate the file type of access the file stream object has with the file itself. So the only available options are read, read-write, or write. So this dictates the type of access you have to the file. So if you use file access.read, then you can only read from that file. You can't write to the file. Read-write will allow you to read and write to a file, and write, you only open up the file to write to the file itself. Now, you'll probably think, okay, we'll just always use read-write because it's the safest option. So if I want to read it, I can. If I want to write, I can. And then the other two is something we will not use. But no, we would like to use the things that are specific to your application. It's not always going to be the fact that you're going to read and write. Sometimes you're just going to write, sometimes you're just going to read. It depends on the execution of your program. So it's good to know what the intended usage is so that you can use the correct format of that file, because it also modifies the file during the use of your application. Read, write like Word. Read, write like Word. I think you simplified that sentence a bit too much. Are you referring to the fact that when Word is open, you can read and write at the same time? Okay, I expected that as much. Yes, basically, to a certain extent. It just refers to the fact that you can read the file stream and that you can write to the file stream as well. So it's not really like Word because you don't actually see the content before modifying it. I guess if you open it up in a rich text file, a rich text box, you can implement something like Word, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it like that, because the way we'll be using it is you have a bit more of a structure, and if you want to do something like a Word implementation, it's going to take a bit more than just a simple file stream object. You have so many additional things that you'll have to execute. All right. So, going back to our scenario, which one are we going to connect to? So we've got our file stream. We're going to connect to file2.dat. We've got our file mode, which is open, and our file access, which is read. So the only way to know that it's you're working with the correct file is the name. Well, you have to specify what file you'll be working with. So as the program, you have to identify the file. You can't just go choose a random file and then modify it. I don't really understand that last question. Because you have an intended use, so the intended use will have a name. No, I understand there's a typo there, but I understand what you're referring to. I just don't understand the fact that you are unsure about the correct file. Because the thing is, you'll be working with a specific file. It's not as if you're going to choose a file at random. When you create it, you're going to create it with a name. And when you're going to try and open it, you're going to try and open it with a specific name. If that name does not exist, it will return and tell you there's an issue. So let's just go through this example quickly, because this actually talks about the connection between the file using a specific file name. So the thing here is you're trying to establish a connection to a file2.dat. The file mode is open, so you just want to open the file, and then the access type is read, which means you just want to read from this file. So you establish a connection with that specific file, or you have different case sensitive. To my knowledge, I always use it as if it's case sensitive, but I don't think VB sees it that way. Easiest way to determine that is to test it out. I haven't worked with VB files in a while, so we'll see. When we execute that, just remind me to test that out for you so you can see. But the easiest way to find that out is to test it. I would treat it as case sensitive because it's important that the system can recognize it. So if you can store a file without case sensitive names, then it's probably not case sensitive. So the easiest way to determine that maybe is, yeah, let's use my desktop. So let's create two text files. One we'll call name, the one we'll call name. Right. So it says, do you want to rename new text file to name2? So that kind of indicates that I can't just have it as name. So there is a clash, which means the program itself is most likely not case sensitive. But we'll test it out when we get to VB in any case. So it's a good question. Right. So it now establishes a connection to the file itself, which means it can be connected. But when a connection is established, what is the most important thing you need to remember? Let's see who listened. Yes, you need to make sure you close the stream. You need to cut the connection. If you don't cut the connection, it's going to break. And breaking is not good. It's never good if that program breaks. So, a new file stream being established, do whatever you need to do to the program and then cut the connection. My recommendation is always the moment you open that file stream, you add the file.close comment as well, so that you make sure whatever happens in between happens, but that you definitely close that connection. Because if you don't close the connection, it will break. I can promise you it will break somewhere. Right. So just a quick recap. What is a file stream object? So as we see it right now, it's a temporary holder for our file, or the contents of our file. How to create a new file, how to open an existing file with the file stream. So that would be our mode and our access. How to prepare the file so that we can write to it. Note we don't have to write. Note we don't have to we don't have the means to write to it yet. Remember, we're still going to show you how to write to it, so don't worry about that. And then the same for read. We showed you how to prepare it, but we didn't show you how to read to it yet and write to it yet. Does VB give a warning in the code that there is no close code? My VB is not set up for that. So I don't think it gives a warning. I generally keep my Visual Basics to default, specifically when we demo code, so that you can see exactly what you will most likely see. I'll have to check because I disable most of my warnings. So we'll check when we demo the code, whether it gives a warning if we don't close it. I suspect it might give you a warning and not an error, but then again, I don't know whether my settings are set like that. It will definitely give you a indication at the end, but how clear that indication is going to be, I'm not sure right now. Because remember, closing the connection, it's when you close the application, it cuts the connection in any case. So it's an automatic, it's kind of like the garbage collector. It will close the connection in any case. So it's another good question to test out. Something to test out visually in terms of the actual application. All right. Is there a size limit for the file that we can sorry. Is there a size limit for the file that can be taken in by the program? I've never actually exceeded that file size, so I've never actually looked into the actual limitations of that. That's another good question. We'll have to test that out. Remember, the file stream is temporary storage, so I would say your limitations is based on how large the temporary storage inside VB will allow you. And the current cap for VB is 2 gigs. The moment it exceeds 2 gigs in memory, it will force close the application. But if you're opening up a 2 gig text file, it's quite a lot. A 2 gig text file is a lot of content. So, or a 2 gigs file that contains text is a lot of content. So just keep in mind that text doesn't take up that much space. Yeah, it's a lot. Believe me, it's a lot. I mean, I can tell you now. Let me just open up one of the documents I have, which is, I think, 180 pages. And that's not even 2 gigs. Let's see. So final corrected version, 5 megabytes, and that's 180 pages, word pages. So it's even larger than a text file. So if you have a 2 gig text file, it's going to be a lot of content. You're talking about a few thousand pages most likely. And it's going to take a while to read and write that as well. So just keep that in mind. You don't want to look. One thing to keep in mind as well is you don't want to save everything in just one file. For now, we're going to show you how to do things simply with just a file. But when you start saving these things, when you do backup files, notice that when you do backup files, specifically for most of you that actually do game, I don't know how many of you actually play Minecraft, but the way Minecraft does backup files, they do regional backup files. So it will have a size bracket or a size block allocation, and certain areas, certain places on your map are saved to specific files instead of having the entire map saved in just one file. It makes it easier to read and it makes it easier to write as well. Yes, you can. If you're referring to multiple files, or do you want to break up the file into smaller bits itself? Yes, there is a way. Right now, so we're still getting to the sequential part. So we're still talking about a file indication. Yes. Keep in mind that you're talking about bits there, or bytes there. You're also referring to characters. So your space characters, your punctuation characters, and all of that also counts as characters. But yes, it is a lot. All right, now breaking up the file, we're still getting to the point where we put files. So there is a way to kind of quickly search through a file as well, but we're still getting to that. For today, all I wanted to show you is the file stream itself. It's like the stepping stone. Just getting you used to the fact of how we're going to open and close these files. But like we have over here, we haven't shown you how to read and write from it yet. That's the next part. That's the next piece of puzzle. But I don't want to start with it and then stop halfway. That's why we're only doing file streams today. So the sequential files, you'll see it is in the slide, so you can start going through that if you want to. Because there you'll see that you've got spaces for each file and how they'll go into the files, and then you've got random allocation as well. You've got your declarations, you've got the format you're going to use to convert it. You've got serializable, deserializable. These are things we're still going to cover. So this is where you're going to learn how to write them. All right. But I don't want to cover that today because we're not going to get done with it all. Don't worry, it's not that bad. We're going to go through it together. So the moment we go through it, you'll see that it is quite easy. But that's why I say, the moment you get behind, just indicate it so that we can make sure that it's covered properly. Because it is going to be in your second semester test. So I want to make sure that you guys are comfortable with the content so that you don't get lost before the second test. When opening the file, is there a way to check if the connection has been established? If you can open the file, the connection has been established. It will show you, it will give you an error if the connection can't be established or when the file can't be opened. Yes, I do play Minecraft, or I used to play Minecraft. We actually run, I run a few Minecraft servers. Or I used to run a few Minecraft servers. We recently closed the servers we had open. No, I won't give you the IP because it's running off of the machine I'm working on right now. Well, it used to. We're getting direct servers for the Minecraft servers. But that's going off topic now. You can do that once the recording has stopped. You can do that. All right. So are there any questions regarding the file stream object? Anyone that got lost anywhere discussing file stream objects? It is a new concept. Right now, it's a theoretical concept. So don't worry too much about this. We'll explore the various option and combination of options with a file. So we will continue with this. It's not going to start and stop here. We're going to continue with this. We're going to build on top of this. I just want to discuss file stream objects first, because if something gets stuck here, then you're going to get stuck in the next part as well. Right, can we go back to the mode enumerations? Just trying to write out the name syntax without referring. I went back. All right, there's a lot of questions there. Okay, so let's go to the argument itself. So with the three modifiers, you've got the location. Pretty sure you guys are okay with, because that's just the directory of where your file is stored. With the mode, the enumerations, it just specifies that there is a value associated to this. So when you say file name dot create, this dot create is a integer representation of a value. It's most likely 1, 2, 3, and 4, option 1, 2, 3, and 4. But the enumeration itself, the variable name of that enumeration, or the enumeration name, is create. But this create, instead of just going 1, 2, 3, or 4, and you having to remember what the number indication is of 1, 2, 3, and 4, it gives you a name that associates with that specific option. What we'll do is, after the recess, in the first tutorial, we'll discuss enumerations. Maybe you'll understand it a bit better then. But essentially, it's just, it's I don't want to say it's a placeholder, but it's a name representation for a value. So we will cover it. Don't worry too much about that. But it's basically an option that you choose. But you're not going to use the integer representation. You're going to be using the enumeration values. So you'll be using file name.create as the example over here. You're going to use that option because it's easier to understand what it does instead of just saying 1 and 1. Basically, yes. That is how enumeration works. So the create will represent a value, the create new will represent a value, the same for open and open or create. It represents a value stored, because that's how enumerations work. It's a constant value, so it's a variable that changes the value. It's a constant variable, or a constant value, if I can explain it like that. But like I said, we'll discuss enumerations once you return from recess in one of the tutorials. You'll understand it a bit better then. But for now, all you need to know is the fact that you'll be using one of these options. So you'll have file mode dot and one of the options, and same for file access dot and one of the options. It's easy to understand what needs to be done because it tells you in the name itself. Remember when we told you to use names that are descriptive? Now, this is one of the reasons why enumerations are so good, is because the name itself will tell you what the representation is of the value. Instead of you just saying option 1 or option 2 and having to keep in the back of your mind what was option 1 and what was option 2 again. Can we use, I think I've missed a question. Let me just double check over here. So in the test, will be open existing files or create files. We haven't set up the second semester test yet. We'll see when we get there. We'll probably determine that after practical 10, because there will be a question about who's struggling with what. So after practical 10, we'll determine that. I think. We'll probably discuss it. We'll see what you're more comfortable with and most likely ask that. All right, then the last question I see here, can we use FileStream to test the program instead of typing inputs every time we want to test the program? Well, you can, but there's only one practical left, and the last practical is a FileStream, so it's not really relevant for your last practical. But it would have, if, let's say, next semester you would have to continue with this work, then that would have been a good way to do your test program, is to have a file stream of the input itself. How would you do it? Are you referring to Oliver's question? Well, let's first go through sequential and random access files, and then we'll come back to that question. Because it doesn't help I explain that question if you don't know how to read and write from a file yet. So once discussed how to read and write from a file, once you understand how the objects are represented in a file, then we can come back to that question. Otherwise, I'm explaining something that you might actually see how it works in our next discussion, because in our next discussion, we are going to talk about how files or objects are represented. For instance, over here, where sequential means data is stored one after the other, and then you've got the item storage inside your file itself. I don't want to go too far ahead, so you'll see what's going to happen. All right, enumerations is a representation of a value. Like I said, we'll discuss it. We'll go through it in the first touch after the recess. We'll discuss enumeration. So please make sure you come to that tutorial. Otherwise, we'll discuss it that Thursday. Otherwise, I can do it today. We can do it. We can do it on our TUT today. So I'll see how many people are attending. I assumed as much. I assumed you would rather have a TUT on the practical tomorrow. So we'll see how much time there is, but there will be a dedicated lecture or TUT to enumerations. Don't worry about that. What I'll do is I'll release the slides so long so that it's on Eve, so you can have a look at it, but we'll have a lecture on it. I won't make it self-study. Don't worry about that. Will VB show an error if you have an invalid mode, an access combination, or it's up to the coder to be logical? If there's an invalid combination, it will show you an error, but if you look at the file mode itself, the file mode is just the file, how you're going to open the file. Is it a new file? Is it an existing file, or a combination of the two? So the file mode is just, are you creating a file or are you opening a file? That's basically what the file mode is. The axis is how you want to use that file. Are you going to read from it? Are you going to read and write from it? Or are you just going to write to it? So the file mode is create a file, otherwise create a new file, except if the file already exists. Otherwise, open an existing file, or if the file does not exist, open and create a file. So the file mode itself is about whether you're creating or opening a file. The file access is whether you're reading and writing from a file. Yes, but open existing file or create a new file. If you're going to try and open an existing file, then you can read from it. If that file does not exist, create a new file. And if you try and read from the file is just going to be empty. So you will be able to read from it, but there's not going to be anything inside the stream itself. The stream will be empty. So logically, it still applies, but practically, there's not going to be anything inside that stream. So it's not an error, it will just be empty. It just depends on the intended use. I don't know if you play the Minecraft game. The people that actually play Minecraft will understand this. But if you have a chunk that's not been loaded before, that chunk file does exist, but the chunk file itself is just empty because the terrain hasn't been generated yet. So it does exist, but it's empty. So when you try and read from it, it's just going to be empty. There's nothing inside. It's not an error, but it's not accessible either. And I'm pretty sure more than half of you don't play the game, so you don't understand what that actually means. It's just because the file exists doesn't mean there's anything inside the file. Because the file name is there. And if it's empty, it's empty. You can read from it, but you're reading nothing. So that's going to be the result, is nothing. So when you try and work with it, if you don't check whether there's something inside the stream itself, your program will then crash. But if you read from a file, you generally want to check if there's something inside that stream itself. So we'll still get to it. So don't worry too much about that. All you need to understand from today is that you can open and create a file and the access mode we have to that specific file. That's all you have to be concerned about for today. After the recess, we'll start talking about how you write to a file and how you read from a file and what happens if there is nothing inside a file and how you handle the different conditions. So we're still going to explore all of those options, so don't worry too much about that. Right, so that is the end of the lecture time period. I don't want to start going over time every single lecture. I'll still be around if you want to ask questions, so those that still have questions, you can stick around for a moment. Otherwise, those watching the recordings, if you got lost somewhere, please just indicate in the lecture channel where you got lost so that I can make sure that we cover it in the TUT a bit more extensively. But for file streams right now, we can do it in small segments. We're not going to jump too much, but please make sure you keep up to date with the file streams and with the read and the write to a file itself, because it's going to be in your second semester test. And it's going to count a lot on your second semester test, so you don't want to get behind now. Right. Other than that, I hope you guys have a lovely weekend, because I'm assuming if you're watching the recording or watching this over the weekend somewhere. And we'll see you in the TUT this afternoon, or we'll see you in about a week and a half after the recess. During this recess, please note that on Monday morning, there will be a boot camp. The details will be posted on Eve if it's not there already. And if you are struggling, please make sure you attend the boot camp. Mr. Singh will be covering that. And if there's any issues, he will indicate it to us. But we've already told him what we want covered based on the results of the practicals and the first semester test. So please, if you're struggling, please make sure you attend the boot camp. He's going to cover the basis of most things. And you can also ask him to cover something specific if you don't understand it. Otherwise, please come to the TUTs. Most of the TUTs, we ask you first what you're struggling with, and then we cover that specifically. All right. So we'll see you guys in this afternoon's TUT. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a lovely recess. Please make sure you use the recess to either catch up on your work or to actually relax for a bit. I'll see you again after the recess. Well, I'll first see you in the TUT and then after the recess.